Okay, welcome back to Gary's Economics.
We already have a tax system which is very good at taxing working people, while people like the Duke of Westminster can inherit £10 billion and pay nothing.
Do you think that's fair?
No.
Do you think that's fair?
No, but again,
So let's change it. Let's tax working people less, your viewers less, and let's tax the billionaires more.
So that's Gary Stevenson. If you're watching this video, then I guess that you've heard of him. He's got a YouTube channel called Gary's Economics, where he talks about the UK economy and the sort of issues that it's facing. Over the last couple of years, he's also been on a lot of politics shows in the UK, basically talking about the economy and a lot about taxation. So his message simplified is that we need to tax rich people more than we do currently. I'm going to leave those conversations to him. He's qualified to talk about them and I'm not. But he talks about a lot of things on his channel. And one of the things that he mentioned a few times is that the government have sold off a lot of our assets. So initially when he said that, my mind sort of went to the Royal Mail, the railways, the water companies, you know, all those things that we hear about quite a lot on the news. But then he mentioned land and property specifically.
Back sort of 50 years ago, Western governments had a lot of wealth. They essentially owned their own house. Now, of course, when we talk about governments, it's not just housing. We're talking about governments owning things like hospitals, like schools. But of course, in the case of the UK government did own also a significant amount of housing back in the 70s. And governments have lost this wealth now.
So I don't know about you, but I wasn't really aware of that. But yeah, after he mentioned it, I got myself into a bit of a rabbit hole, and it turns out it's true. We have sold off a lot of our property since the 70s. So that's what this video is about. I'm going to cover some of the policies and the logic behind selling off our land. And then I'm going to cover two government initiatives. One that hasn't happened yet, but was announced recently by the Labour government, called the British Infrastructure Taskforce, which basically means working with businesses to borrow money from them, and then they're going to help build new infrastructure and we'll sort of pay them back over the long term, which sounds fine as an idea, but we have done the exact same thing in the past with a lot of the same businesses, but that was called the Private Finance Initiative. So they started in the 90s, they were cancelled in 2018 when it became public knowledge that they were really bad deals for us and really good deals for the companies we were working with. And when they were cancelled, both the Conservative government at the time and the Labour Party tried to distance themselves from the deals and blame each other, when in fact they were both guilty on signing off on lots of those deals. So yeah, that's what this video is about. The beginning of this ideology of selling off our land began at the same time as selling off our utilities under Margaret Thatcher. She came into power in 1979. And by 1980, she introduced a policy called the Local Government Planning and Land Act. And the first sentence of that policy is, an act to relax controls over local and certain other authorities. So basically that meant that the government could take power away from local councils and they could sell their land off for them, essentially force their hand into selling off land regardless of whether the council wanted to or not. So all the councils were forced to put all the land that they owned into a list that the government could access. They could look at what that land was being used for, they could decide whether they thought it was worthy or not. And if the land wasn't being used, so if they had some land that wasn't being used at all in that period and hadn't been used for a couple of years, then they would just immediately sell it off. Which I think feels a little bit short-sighted because governments are always creating new departments to deal with modern issues, right? So in 2023, the Tory government at the time created 4 new departments, and they're all listed in this article here. And obviously they get ministers to head up those departments, like Ed Miliband here is the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero. So I think Margaret Thatcher could have done something similar. You know, she could have hired somebody or got a minister in to look at the land that we had and said, how do we profit from this land in the long term, rather than let's just sell it immediately. Another option for the government would have been hiring a minister from outside of government. So a good example of that at the moment is James Timpson, who is the Minister of State, Prisons, Probation and Reducing Reoffending for the Labour Party. The reason he got this role is he's been on the board for lots of initiatives helping former offenders get work. And he's also employed a lot of these people in his company, which is Timpson, you know, the key cut in place. Lots of councillors and lots of economists pushed back at the time. They predicted what has happened would happen, and that was that we're going to struggle to build affordable homes in the future. There would be a housing crisis, which we have in the UK now. And it also meant that we sold a lot of land under value. So we would sell land to a property developer, for example. They get planning approval to build on that land, and then the value of it would shoot up. So another scheme started under the Thatcher was the right to buy scheme, which basically meant that people could buy social homes that they were living in. Now, in theory, like if that was announced today, I'd probably say, oh, that sounds like an all right idea. I think it gives people the opportunity to buy homes that might not be able to otherwise. But a lot of the homes that were sold are now privately let out. More than 4 in 10 council homes under right to buy are now owned by private landlords. In Brighton, 86% of homes sold have been privately rented. In Milton Keynes, 73%. into over 59%. So maybe there should have been something in the contracts, because it just means that now we have an even bigger problem today. We have more people who have less money that would have got social homes back in the day, but now there's not enough, so they're not going to get them. So they either need to pay top rates, or they're going to need to be subsidised from the government. They're going to need to get some kind of benefits, which is just more taxpayer money. Whereas if we'd maybe kept those homes, maybe that could have helped us buy a little bit more land and build more of them, and then the country would be in a better state than it is right now. So fast forward to today, we've sort of continued along the lines of selling off a lot of our property and lands, like consecutive governments. I've been slagging Margaret Thatcher off, but the Labour Party continued it under Blair, under Gordon Brown, and then it was continued again when the Tories got back in under David Cameron. And that inspired Brett Christophers to write this book, The New Enclosure. So the point of the book is sort of similar to this video. He goes into a lot more detail, but it's about the selling off of our public land being less covered than the privatisation of anything else. We all know about the public utilities. But he also wrote this article where he gives some specific stats, and it's titled, "If this public land sell-off continues, there could be none left by 2050. Public land ownership in Britain is in crisis. Since the late 70s, when the government began what has turned into a long-term land privatisation programme, about half of all public land, 2 million hectares in total, or 10% of Britain's overall land area, has been sold, mainly to private companies." So that means in the 70s we owned about a fifth of all the land in Britain, and now we own about a tenth of it collectively. Then he goes on to mention the NHS, where he says the NHS estate has been even more radically depleted, shrinking by around 70%. So I'm going to put a pin in this. I'm going to come back to this section because at the beginning of the video I mentioned the private finance initiative. So most of those deals were made within the NHS. We built a lot of new hospitals under that scheme. So I'm going to come back to this and cover it in a bit more detail later on. But a lot of NHS land was sold under David Cameron's government as well. Jeremy Hunt sold off a lot of that land. He said he was going to build affordable homes, and there was going to be some scheme where nurses would get first dibs or something, but that didn't end up materialising in the way that he said it would. So in the policy that Thatcher created, it was stated that with the profit that we made from selling off our land and our property, we were going to use that money to invest in new government assets. So we were going to buy new things to help us grow our wealth over the long term. So there's two problems with that, in my opinion. The first one is that it's a bit contradictory. Why are we selling buildings off to buy new things rather than looking at the buildings that we already had and saying, how do we profit from these things here over the long term? Can we lease them to private companies? Can we build affordable homes? There's lots of different options that existed, and lots of clever people were pointing out those options at the time. And the second point, which is probably more important, is that we obviously didn't reinvest that money into new assets because we own a lot less than we did back then, and the economy's struggling. So yeah, I don't know what they did with that money. So the reason I mention that is because that law changed in 2016, as it's mentioned in this article here, which is titled "Councils Forced to Sell Off Parks, Buildings and Art to Fund Basic Services." Yeah, and it says here, a change in the law in 2016 meant councils no longer had to buy new public assets with the money made from selling them, and instead could use the money to make up for shortfalls in funding. Basic services means things like healthcare, things like transport. They are things that need to be paid for, but the problem with using the profit from the sale of a park, for example, is that's a temporary fix, right? That profit's only going to go so far. So it means that when that money runs out, when the profit from the park runs out, we're going to need to sell more things to plug those funding gaps, and eventually we're going to have nothing left to sell. But then there's another article, this was written in 2023, £15 billion worth of public assets sold by English councils since 2010 amid budget shortfalls. And it goes on to say, but the most eye-catching examples of asset sales this year has to be the decision by Hertfordshire County Council to sell off more than 1,600 works of art. I just think it's a massive shame that we've got to a point where we literally need to sell our culture off to pay for basic services. And when these works of art are sold, they're not necessarily going to go to other museums or anyone in the UK or anywhere that we can go and look at them. They're going to go to the highest bidder, and that can be anyone who lives anywhere in the world. So yeah, it's just a bit shit. So that's just a quick overview from the 70s through till today, covering some of the logic behind selling off our land and sort of where it's led us to, which is with a struggling economy and an unaffordable housing market for most people. But yeah, I want to move on to the next section of the video because it feels that we're going to continue down the same path even further. And that's because Keir Starmer announced something which I mentioned in the intro, which is called the British Infrastructure Taskforce. So yeah, it says here, government launches British Infrastructure Taskforce. Private finance experts met the Chancellor at number 11 Downing Street today to boost investment in infrastructure and drive growth nationwide. And it goes on to say, Keir Starmer will promise to slash red tape and rip out the bureaucracy that blocks investment. When I hear Keir Starmer saying things like that, it sort of reminds me a little bit of Donald Trump when he's talking about drain the swamp. It just doesn't sit right with me. He's trying to make it him versus the law, and the law are the bad people trying to stop our country from prospering. When actually it's the decisions of previous governments, including Labour governments, that the country is struggling. Not lawyers or laws or regulations that have made our country struggle, it's consecutive governments and the shit decisions that they've made. So the company we're going to be working most closely with, or the one that I've heard reported on the most, are BlackRock. So they're an asset management company, which means that they look after assets, so property for clients and money for clients as well, and they help them decide what's the best way to make the most money from these assets over the long term. And BlackRock have been written about quite a lot, so I'm going to go over a few articles to give you a bit of context to what kind of business they are. So here it says direct ownership is the main game, but not the only one. Big finance can also invest in infrastructure indirectly by lending to private infrastructure companies. The key is returns. So the main key for them, like any business, is they want to make as much money as possible, right? So they've got around 10 trillion under its management. BlackRock is among the most powerful financial institutions on the planet. To many, it's among the most evil, in quotation marks. That's not my words, that's this article and whoever said it. And they say that because it continues to pump billions into fossil fuels and arms companies. So they have a few controversial investments. They also have a few contradictory investments, as this next article states. Already, BlackRock is betting on becoming a provider of green energy infrastructure, though its actual commitment to tackling the climate crisis only extends so far. The firm has lobbied heavily against European proposals to regulate its lending to fossil fuel interests with penalties, and has instead called for voluntary climate commitments. So yeah, they're investing money into the fossil fuel industry and into the green energy industry, and they're even lobbying against regulations that are being put on fossil fuel companies. Which is a little bit contradictory. I'm not sure what they're trying to do there. Probably just to make as much money for as long as they possibly can from the fossil fuel industry. So on BlackRock's Wikipedia page, it has a subtitle here called Controversies, and you can drop down and there's lots of examples of controversial investments. So I'm not going to go into detail on those controversies because this video isn't about BlackRock and their history. If you want to look into it, you can. I think what it says to me and what their investments into the fossil fuel and green energy sectors say to me is that this company don't really have an ideology other than how do we make as much money as we possibly can. You know, we don't care who it comes from, we don't care where it comes from, we don't care what they need to do, we just want to make as much money as possible. Now, some people will say that's just business, and that's fine, but my opinion is a company like that isn't the best one to work with a public body, right? Particularly not our government, because BlackRock are just going to be thinking, how do we make as much money as possible? They're not going to be thinking, oh, how do we make sure the British people get the best buildings and services possible? That's just not going to be, you know, the way that they're looking at it. And another thing here, which I think is a little bit concerning to read, is that BlackRock want their investments to be de-risked. So it says here, in simple terms, the government's plan to use public funds to de-risk private investment means that the taxpayer takes on much of the risk involved, while the private sector stands to reap most of the benefits. This is particularly true of essential infrastructure, which the government cannot let fail and so must step in to cover losses in the event that something goes wrong. So that means that BlackRock could build a railway, for example. That railway might not be fit for purpose, and then it would be taxpayer money that's used to repair that, rather than anything ever coming out of their profits. So even if they build something that isn't good enough or isn't fit for purpose, it will never impact their profits. To me, that sort of defeats the point of what this privatisation ideology was all about. Using Thatcher's ideology against her, she sort of said that these companies were going to push each other to create the best services and the best buildings possible. That was sort of the whole point. But if their investments are de-risked and they're going to be able to get their money no matter what, then where is their drive to create the best thing possible, right? It's not really going to be there because no matter what happens, they're going to get paid, they're going to get their money. So yeah, anyway, that's all I have to say about the British Infrastructure Taskforce. You know, that hasn't happened yet, those deals haven't happened yet, so I can't go into any more detail. I think we'll find out in the long term, sort of, whether they're good or bad for us. But I can compare them to something that they sound really similar to, which is the Private Finance Initiative, or PFIs. So here it states what a private finance initiative is, or a PFI deal. A private finance initiative is a way of financing public sector projects through the private sector. PFIs alleviate the government and taxpayers of the immediate burden of coming up with the capital for these projects. Under a private finance initiative, a private company handles the upfront costs instead of the government. In return, the government authority makes payments to the private companies over the long term. And I mentioned in the introduction that when the PFIs were cancelled, when it was announced we weren't going to sign off any more of these deals, both the Conservative government and Labour Party tried to distance themselves from the deals. So before I go into more detail, I'm going to play you the clip of when they were cancelled.
The Shadow Chancellor, of course, rages against PFI at every opportunity, yet curiously forgets to mention that nearly 90% of those contracts were agreed by the last Labour government, leaving the nation with a bill of more than £200 billion to pay off. We will honour existing contracts, but the days of the public sector being a pushover must end. And we will go further. I have never signed off a PFI contract as Chancellor, and I can confirm today that I never will.
And the main reason they were cancelled is because it became public knowledge that these deals were really bad for the public. The reality is that they were started under a Conservative government. Yes, they were massively extended under Tony Blair and again under Gordon Brown, but they were still extended even further under David Cameron's government. And when it became public knowledge that these deals weren't very good for us, then they both tried to backtrack and blame each other for them. And in this article, titled The Great PFI Heist, the real story of how Britain's economy has been left high and dry by a doomed economic philosophy, it states, in 2018, after the collapse of Carillion, which was the main provider for two major hospital construction contracts, both under PFI, the government decided to stop any new PFI deals. And Carillion, they won quite a lot of contracts over the years, both under the PFI scheme and just for the NHS more generally, and they failed quite a few times as well. If you look into them, there's a lot of controversial sort of moments for them as well. When they collapsed, so they went bankrupt, it became public knowledge that these PFI deals weren't working. So the reason I pointed that out is it reminds me of something earlier in the video when Keir Starmer was mentioning removing red tape. The reason that we have regulation is so that companies like Carillion don't win contracts because they can't fulfill them, and then it ends up costing us loads more money later. So another example of that would be during COVID and what is now known as the PPE scandal, where people that knew Conservative politicians all of a sudden started to manufacture PPE. When they gave us the PPE, it wasn't up to scratch. It was unusable, we had to burn a lot of it, and we've written off like £10 billion. So we actually, if anything, I would say need more regulation so we stop getting ripped off, not less of it. So now I'm going to go into more detail on the PFI deals within the NHS because that's where they've been written about the most. So there's lots of numbers and data that I can refer to. So the health minister at the time was Alan Milburn. He's not quite as famous as Blair and Brown, I guess because he was never Prime Minister, but he was heavily involved in the PFI deals within the NHS and he was massively fond of them. So there's a quote from him here. Despite what its sometimes vocal opponents say, PFI is a partnership that works as an addition, not an alternative to public sector capital investment. PFI is helping deliver the biggest new hospital building programme that NHS has ever seen. It is allowing more NHS buildings to be built more quickly. PFI is here and it's here to stay. And in this next article it says Milburn went further still and told MPs PFIs could deliver actual savings as well as value for money. And then there's this next quote from him where I'm just going to read the last line. If they're built through the PFI, they are better value for money. So Milburn was wrong about those deals. They were an absolute disaster for the NHS, the PFI deals. And in this next article, it states what Alan Milburn went on to do next. So Milburn, the NHS and Britain's revolving door is the title. He went to work for PricewaterhouseCoopers, the world's largest accounting and consultancy firm. And it states here, they've been extensively involved in negotiation of PFI deals in the UK. So I can't understand why they would want to work with Alan Milburn, why they want to hire him, because in the contract negotiations, they kind of schooled him, right? They were really good for those companies, the private companies, really bad for the public sector. So why would they want to work with someone who they kind of made mincemeat of? I don't know, maybe he's a really funny guy, maybe he's really good for team morale, or maybe there's another reason, but yeah, I can't make sense of it myself. In this next article, which is titled The Blairite Behind Labour's NHS Overall, it states what Alan Milburn is doing today. And he is the current government's chief health advisor. So yes, he's working for Keir Starmer's government. And earlier this year, Alan Milburn stated that the government can only afford to reform the NHS rather than keep pumping more money into it. So he's been hired to give advice on how to reform his earlier reforms. And now we're going to carry on with the PFI stuff. I got sidetracked a little bit with him, and here's some details of the contracts. Under the PFI contracts, the NHS trusts, not the private companies, bear the risk of high inflation, which means that the payments to PFI companies may increase substantially as the retail price index rises. The rise in inflation will consequently not dent substantially, if at all, the profits of the PFI companies. In this next article by the Labour Research Department, which is titled PFI, the rip-off that just keeps on taking. So, in this article states, the big concern with last year's massive increase in inflation is that it will result in a big jump in many trusts' PFI annual payments, and once they go up, they don't go back down. So yeah, it's written into the PFI contracts that our payments will increase with inflation. Then when inflation falls, our payments don't fall with it. They just continue to increase or stay the same. So there's a bit of oversight in the contracts there. And you must be thinking that the buildings that they built for us, the hospitals, must be incredible. They must have been things that we could have never done ourselves. But it turns out that's not the case either, and it states that in this article. So this is part of that same article, buildings riddled with problems. All of the buildings visited were riddled with structural and design problems. So a little bit further down here, it says these design flaws continued for a whole round of hospitals that were built, integrating the same problems again and again. So yeah, not only were the contracts not very good for us, but the hospitals themselves needed continual maintenance. And that leads me on to the next problem with the PFI contracts. Many PFI contracts came with strings attached facilities maintenance. So what that means is that we had to use maintenance provided from these PFI companies as well. So it was written into the contract. It was law that we had to use them. So, you know, a hospital in Liverpool couldn't shop around locally and get the best deal. They had to use whatever the PFI companies provided. So here's some examples of how much that maintenance work costs. So in this Telegraph article, which is titled Private Finance Initiative, Hospitals Will Bring Taxpayers 60 Years of Pain. So further into this article, it says a hospital which charged £52,000 for a job that cost £750. So 52 grand for something that should have cost 750 quid. So there's a little bit of a markup there. And the Daily Mail also reported on some of the maintenance costs. It says here what hospitals were forced to pay. The two worst examples were 13 grand to install 3 lights and 8 grand to install a dishwasher. So it's not just for payments on the large amounts of debt that hospitals need to make each year. There's also these huge maintenance costs. And there'll be loads of those that haven't been reported on. So yeah, here's some specifics about how much it's costing hospitals each year in PFI debt. In this article by The Independent, it says some hospitals are spending more on PFI debt than they are on drugs. And there's a list here of 10 hospitals that are spending 10% or more on PFI debt each year. So if you're spending 10% of your budget every year on a PFI debt, that means that every 10 years, one of those years is going to go unfunded essentially. So obviously that's going to create a lot of financial strain on these hospitals. So, and a little bit further into the article, it says a further 21 trusts also spent more on paying back their PFI debt than on drugs, according to the accounting data. So yeah, like these PFI deals really, they haven't worked at all in our favour. And for a long time, like the details of these contracts were kept under wraps. So yeah, and that's what worries me about this British Infrastructure Taskforce. Like it literally involves a lot of the same companies. So when Keir Starmer's talking about deregulation, I think everybody should be sceptical when they hear that. So that leads me on to sort of the final part of the video where it's like, what else could we have done or what are other countries doing? So we can look at Finland, who are reported to be the happiest country in the world. Public land ownership and leasing in Helsinki, Finland. Helsinki owns about 70% of its land area and therefore is able to play a major role in providing and promoting affordable housing. And that's not just in Helsinki, they own a lot of the land in Finland, and it means that, yeah, there's no housing crisis, it's an affordable place to live. And they're not anti-business either, they also lease out land to businesses, and they have really long-term contracts, they last like 60 or 70 years. So basically banks then treat that the same as ownership, because the leases are so long, so they'll give them loans at the same rate they would if those businesses owned the land themselves. So it works out well for Finland, the government, the Finnish people, and it also works out well for the companies. It doesn't really affect their profits. And it's a similar situation in Austria, in Vienna, the social housing secret, how Vienna became the world's most livable city. Part of the reason this fella's apartment is so affordable is simple, it's owned by the city. So it just shows that having some public ownership is quite a good thing. It means that countries are affordable places to live. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't be able to make decent money or shouldn't be able to start their own businesses and do well for themselves. Of course they should. But the point of public ownership, or the main point sort of in my eyes, is that it's an affordable place to live. So it really decreases the amount of poverty, it decreases the amount of crime, it decreases the strain on the NHS, on other public services. It just makes our country a nicer place to live, you know? So yeah, I think the way we did these deals, the way we sold off this land was really short-sighted and we fucked up a little bit. And that leads me on to the final article of the video. The UK's housing is worst value for money of any advanced economy. So yeah, that's a bit of an overview behind the logic of selling off a lot of our land, and to me it seems that we're going to continue down the same path because the British Infrastructure Taskforce involves a lot of the same businesses that we worked with on the PFI deals. So there's a famous quote which is, to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results is the definition of insanity. But it's also been government policy in the UK for about 35 years. But yeah, that's it. Let me know what you think.